Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. For those who don't know, my name is Amanda Sue, and I want to thank everybody for being here in person and our folks online for coming to my thesis defense presentation. I'm going to be talking you through my master's thesis research, which is titled, I Love the Job I Just Can't, Examining Job Burnout Among Gen Z Local Television Journalists. This has been a project that's been 2 years in the making, and so I'm really excited to finally share with you all what I found so far. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to go through my lit review and talk through the theory that I used. I also am going to talk through my research questions and the methods I used to fulfill those objectives. And then finally talk us through my findings, discussion, and my conclusion. So I thought it would be helpful to get us all on the same page on what burnout actually is. And so the World Health Organization defines it as chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And it has 3 characterizations: exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy, or feelings of a lack of achievement or ineffectiveness at work. Now, burnout has been shown to impact one's psychological health, physical health, and also have occupational outcomes, so things like turnover and absenteeism among employees. Now, specifically looking at journalism, it's a pretty big problem. A recent study just from last year found that about 7 in 10 local journalists here in the US reported experiencing burnout. Now, journalism burnout isn't a new thing. It's been studied since at least the 1980s. And one thing that's been consistent with all those decades of research so far is that younger journalists and those with less experience are the most at risk for burnout. And that's a point we're going to remember for later on. Now, most of the research that I've seen so far looking at burnout amongst journalists have really focused it on newspaper settings and reporters when we think about roles. And so I want to highlight some research gaps that I think my thesis can fill. So the first research gap has to do with our television journalists. These are individuals who are still a very important part of the modern day news diet. Even then, the last time a study really looked at these journalists in terms of burnout and stress was published back in 2013, 2014, which is a whopping 10 years ago. And a lot of things have changed since then. The other population I want to look at are our Generation Z members. They are individuals who are born in 1997 to 2012 or 12 to 27 years old this year. We know them not only because they're digital natives, not only because they're more vocal about their mental health, but also because they are the newest cohort of employees to join the workforce. Now, remember the point I mentioned about how younger journalists are the most at risk for burnout. That's a little bit concerning for our Gen Zers because they are coming into their newsrooms as the youngest journalists as well. And so I want to tackle these 2 populations in my thesis research. One other thing I want to highlight too, even though burnout is such a big problem for journalists, there is a lack of practical resources and applied studies in terms of effectively alleviating that stress and burnout amongst journalists. Also, another thing, burnout as a concept has a lot of ambiguity around it. These authors here mentioned that basically how burnout is researched is not the same as how it's used in public discourse. And so I'm hoping that my thesis provides some clarity to these 2 problems. Here's a quick look at the model that I'm using to kind of inform my study. It's called the Job Demands Resources Model of Burnout, also known as the JDR model. It basically focuses on how job characteristics can impact one's risk for burnout. Some elements I want to highlight here. First are our job demands. These are aspects of the job that require sustained physical or mental effort, and an overload of that can lead to exhaustion and health problems as well. On the other side, we have job resources. These are the aspects of the job that are motivational. It helps employees achieve their work goals and regulates the impact of those job demands. And so when you have those resources, you feel more motivated and engaged at work. And so the opposite of that, when you have a lack of resources, it leads to one feeling disengaged from their work. And in combination, these 2 things can lead to burnout. Another element I want to mention outside of the job characteristics is personal resources. This is something that was added by the authors to the model. And they mentioned that this has to do with positive self-beliefs linked to resiliency. So it's all about things like optimism, self-efficacy, as well as resiliency. And so they say when somebody has a more positive self-belief system, have more personal resources, they are less likely to experience stress and burnout. Now, specifically in the realm of journalism, this model has not been applied a lot. I've only seen a handful of studies that have done it. And so I'm hoping that my research can further scholarship in that area as well. And so keeping in mind that I want to look into Gen Z television journalists experiencing burnout, these were the 5 research questions that I came up with to really tackle this problem in a more deeper meaning. I first wanted to figure out how they define burnout and how they experienced it. I also wanted to look into the job demands and resources that played a factor into their burnout experience. So really focusing on the model that we just talked about. My last 2 research questions focus on suggestions firsthand from these journalists about what they think newsroom leadership and educators can do better to help alleviate burnout in a more effective way in the industry. And so with all this in mind, I decided to take a more qualitative approach to answering my research questions. I conducted interviews with 25 Gen Z journalists, all 18 up, who were working at local television stations affiliated with these 4 networks. I held most of these interviews back in March, well, all of the interviews back in March, and most of them were held on Zoom. Once I was done with those interviews, I conducted a thematic analysis, and to protect the participants' identity, but also add context to their work situations, I decided to refer to them by their job title, a range that includes their TV market size, as well as their pronouns to give a bit more context. Finally, when I was done with the analysis and wrote it all up, I sent my findings off to my participants to get their feedback on it. So far, I've heard from 19 out of 25 of my participants, all who say this was resonated well with their own experiences. So nothing major thus far. Here's a quick overview of who I spoke to for my interviews. I had a good mix of on-air and off-air roles. You can see that full list over there. 10 of my participants out of 25 were working in a producing role, and I had 1 manager in my sample. She was an executive producer. Looking at TV market sizes, most of them were working in the top 50 market. Most of my participants were also working in their first market as well. Looking at the years of professional experience, I had a big range from 10 months to up to 7 years. This guy over here was a freelancer who started right out of high school. So he's like the anomaly in my sample. So jumping into the findings. My first research question looked at how these journalists defined burnout. And these were the 7 themes that came back in my interviews. We see a lot of similar things like exhaustion and ineffectiveness, all tying back to what we've already talked about. But I really want to focus on this first theme over here that was mentioned the most often by my participants, which was a loss of motivation, interest, purpose, and passion. These were some of the quotes that from the participants who talked about this particular definition. For example, one sports producer compared it to, his job losing that sparkle that he was, thinking about in the first place. One news producer said for her, burnout was when, I love what I do, I just physically can't bring myself to want to do it anymore. So feeling that loss of interest, that passion there. Now, to tap into the experiences of my participants regarding stress and burnout, I wanted to first ask them if they've actually experienced burnout before. And to nobody's surprise, most of them said yes. 23 out of 25 of my participants said yes, often quickly and confidently. Most of these participants said they were either experiencing it at the time of the interviews. Some said they had experienced it prior at some point in their journalism career. On the other side, I had 2 participants who said they did not experience burnout so far. One said that he saw it as a possibility that he would have to deal with in the future in his career. The other one said he just didn't feel that burnout on a big scale because he still felt pretty engaged with his job. One thing to note is that both of these participants had the least number of years of experience amongst the entire sample. Now, looking more into the experience, I asked them about how burnout impacted their lives, and this is how it kind of split across. Looking specifically at work, most of my participants said that when they were burnt out, they resorted to doing the bare minimum at work, either because they felt too tired or just too demotivated to care to go above and beyond. Other than that, most of my participants also said that their burnout manifested as negativity and cynicism towards their job and through work. That meant that they were lashing out at their coworkers or even spent a lot of time crying at work. Some participants also mentioned they experienced a lot of dread when they were experiencing burnout, and that manifested as them coming in to work late or just skipping work entirely. Looking at the impact outside of work, 16 of my participants said they were basically just too tired to do anything. So that meant that cooking, chores, dating life, social life all went out the window when they were burnt out. Some of my participants also mentioned that negativity and cynicism that they experienced at work also spilled over into their personal lives, saying that this impacted some of the relationships they had with their friends and family. Other than that, some of my participants also mentioned that burnout took an impact on their health. As far as physical goes, some of my participants said they reported experiencing weight changes, experiencing eye twitching, even seeing changes to their mental health. On a mental note, my participants shared that burnout exacerbated their existing mental health conditions, including things like depression and anxiety. I also asked these participants about how they typically cope with burnout, and these were some of the responses they gave me. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to touch on a couple. So looking at support system, which was the most mentioned one, they relied on the support systems both within news and outside of news. As far as therapy goes, they either started therapy because of their jobs or were already in therapy prior to their jobs. Work-life balance, this was really all about creating that barrier between them and their workplace. So that meant putting away their work phones, switching off their work notifications, especially when they were not at work. My 3 participants who told me that they relied on alcohol to cope with their stress and burnout, they self-reported it as being a more casual consumption, saying that they had 1 or 2 glasses by themselves or with their friends. I had 4 participants who admitted to not coping with their stress and burnout at all, either because they were too tired to do it, either because they were too busy to do it, or they just didn't want to, or they just didn't know how to. Now, my thesis is really all about the Gen Z experience. And so I wanted to ask these participants if they felt stress and burnout was differently experienced for them than before, and most of them said yes. These are some of the reasons that came back in my interviews, but I'm only going to go through a couple of these. So the most commonly cited reason for why stress and burnout was different for this generation is the industry has changed. A lot of them acknowledge that the way that they're practicing journalism now, it's a different role from what generations before have practiced in. So they mentioned things like the MMJ model and the inclusion of social media and technology in the 24-hour news cycle as increasing their workload and just making it a completely different place than before. They also mentioned outdated pay, right? Even though their workload increased, their pay did not keep up with that and with cost of living and inflation. So that just added additional stress for them. They also mentioned things like the anti-press attitudes that are currently going through in this generation, which is something they said did not happen before. Talking about, Gen Z being more vocal about mental health. This was a really big reason for why why burnout and stress was different for them. They mentioned that because they were no longer going to subject themselves to the older generation's suck it up mindset. That wasn't enough for them to keep going at their jobs. They wanted to prioritize their mental health and their selves. And so these were some of the reasons why burnout was different for these journalists. Now, research has shown that burnout can trigger turnover intentions. So I wanted to ask if this was the same for my particular sample. And again, to nobody's surprise, most of them said yes to experiencing intentions of changing their jobs or careers. They were all considering looking at opportunities within news and outside of news. Most of them questioned the sustainability of whether they could stay in the job long-term or even in the career in general. But many of these participants still said that they were very determined to stay in their jobs, most often because journalism was still very rewarding and they couldn't imagine themselves doing a job that was more fulfilling. A lot of them called PR the dark side. So other than that, some of my participants mentioned that they felt, pretty new to the job. And so they didn't want to give up on it just yet. And they wanted to tackle it as long as they could until they couldn't anymore. On the other side, I had 3 participants who said they did not experience any turnover intentions. Their reasons kind of varied from they knew their current job wasn't forever. They were still new to the industry, and so they haven't gotten to that point yet. And unfortunately, one of my post producers said that he just did not have enough time to think about turnover intentions because he was so busy at work. Okay, moving on to my third research question, which is all about the job demands and resources that play into these burnout experiences for these journalists. As you can see, it's a pretty long list. There's 16 total up here that came out from my interviews. And so I'm not going to go through all of them for time's sake, but I want to highlight these 2 up here, which was cited most often by my participants. So doing more with less was mentioned by 25 of my participants, all of them. And this was all about having a high workload, but not having enough resources to compensate for it. One of the resources that was highlighted most often, specifically by 16 out of 25, was low pay. A lot of them said their pay was insufficient, inadequate, and unfair. And a lot of them shared that they were basically living paycheck to paycheck, sometimes struggling to afford the basic necessities. And this is what one photojournalist had to say. This financial pressure was not only current, but it was something that he felt like he was going to have to deal with in the future as well. He shares, I can't buy a house or have a family or anything. It feels like more of a struggle now, and there's no reward for all the work that we have to do. The other resources that they mentioned that they felt was lackluster was staffing. A lot of them mentioned that they had extremely high turnover in the newsrooms and they never recovered from those missing positions. Time was also a resource that they felt was lacking. A lot of these participants felt a lot of stress when they didn't have enough time to basically put the work and produce it the way that they wanted to. Other resources they mentioned was content. This was mentioned by specifically news producers who said that they just didn't have enough content to fill their shows because they were fighting for it with everybody else who needed it. Degrading equipment was another resource. So things like broken lights, cameras malfunctioning, SD cards malfunctioning. And then some participants mentioned they were working at duopoly stations or co-owned stations, which basically meant that while their their workload and their coverage doubled, their resources didn't keep up with that. The other job demand I want to highlight, this was issues in management mentioned by 18 out of 25 of my participants. They all basically kind of said that they were either going through mistreatment from managers or were working with unprofessional or untrained managers. They also mentioned that they experienced a lack of support and care, so a lack of training, a lack of guidance, and even a lack of grace when they were going through emotional distressing situations. There was also a disconnect between these journalists and their managers, and they felt this in terms of age, in terms of roles, like having managers who didn't work in their particular roles before. They also had that disconnect in terms of expectations. So their managers were asking them for more than what they could actually realistically do. A lack of positive reinforcement was also a big thing here. A lot of them reported receiving overly critical and negative feedback, and it was rare for them to hear any positive reinforcement from their managers. As one news producer summarized, it basically felt like the managers lost sight of what it means or what it meant to be in the trenches. They're not empathetic to burnout or to what the people on the floor are actually doing. On the flip side, we have the job resources, which are parts of the job that, engaged and motivated these journalists. There are 12 in total that came back from my interviews, which in comparison to the 16 job demands is a little bit lesser. Again, for time's sake, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to focus on the top 2 here that were mentioned the most often by these journalists. So the first is community impact. What was really fulfilling for most of these journalists was getting to see the impact of their stories on their community, seeing that the work that they put into made a difference in their community. For them, it's kind of like, having a purpose behind the pain. But unfortunately, as fulfilling as this is, they still found it extremely rare to ever receive feedback like this. And so when it did happen, it was great, but it doesn't happen a lot. They had a job resource that was really important for these journalists was having support from the newsroom/coworkers. A lot of them talked about, having that camaraderie, that support system. Some even called it a trauma bond with the people that they were working with every day. Most of them mentioned that it was kind of within the people on the floor, the little people, though some did say that this also included their managers. As one photojournalist put it, it's basically like we're all in this together. Lastly, even though I didn't talk about personal resources specifically in my interview questions, this still came up as a theme for some of the participants that I spoke to. When we talk about personal resources, they often refer to it as stuff that help to quell their stress and burnout and also quell their turnover intentions. I'm not going to go through this in more detail, but basically this included, having optimism for the future, being motivated to achieve their personal goals, feelings of self-efficacy and resiliency. I had one participant who shared that her religion played a really important part in quelling stress and burnout because she was really committed to upholding the values of her religion through her work. So to the next research question, which is all about suggestions for newsroom leadership, I first wanted to ask participants about how their support looked like at work. And so out of the 25 that I interviewed, 14 of them said that they did receive some sort of support from the organization in dealing with stress and burnout. The most commonly cited ones were the employee assistance programs, limited free therapy sessions through their employee benefits, and having managers who were aware and proactive about mental health, stress, and burnout in the industry. However, half of these respondents also shared that they felt the resources that they had was still lackluster because it didn't truly effectively help to alleviate that stress and burnout. And they all basically said that more could be done. And so these were some of the suggestions that came back from these individuals on what they think managers could do or what they would want to do themselves as managers themselves. This was 11 themes in total. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through everything, but I'm going to talk about the top 2 here, which is be available and transparent and prioritize mental health resources. So the first theme here is really all about managers being available and transparent with their employees. These journalists really wanted managers to have that open door, that open channel of communication with them, and even create a genuine safe space for them to talk about what they were going through and be vulnerable about the help that they needed at work. They also wanted managers to be transparent about decision-making processes, especially when it comes to news gathering processes that impacted these journalists themselves. They recommended for managers to conduct check-ins with their journalists, not only during the tough days, but also during the mundane, plain days, because that way they can build a bond and keep up to date with these journalists' mental health and well-being. The other suggestion I want to mention is prioritizing mental health resources. All of these journalists who mentioned this highlighted a need for free therapy and counseling for all journalists. As one news producer mentioned, this is trauma being thrown at you because of your workplace. Your workplace should have some responsibility in dealing with that. Some other resources they mentioned was bringing in an on-site therapist, so kind of like a school nurse almost, bringing in therapy dogs, creating a hotline for journalists to call into with no strings attached, and even implementing mental health days into employee benefits that do not impact PTO days. Switching to the educational side, I talked to these participants about what that looked like for them when they were going through school, and 24 out of 25 said they did receive some sort of higher education in journalism, whether that was through trade school or going to get a bachelor's. Out of these journalists, 13 said they did not learn about stress and burnout or how to cope with it in school. As one of my participants remarked, no, never, never. Out of the remaining 11 who said they did learn about it in school, 7 said they learned about it through journalism classes, 4 said that they learned it through non-journalism contexts, so things like extracurriculars, outside electives, and just generally coping through life. Now, the big theme that came back in my conversation with these individuals was that there was a lot of acknowledgement about stress and burnout, the problem, but a lot of actionable steps in dealing with it. So my participants kind of referred to it as a footnote of a lesson, or referred to it as a club mentality, right? If you get it, you get it. Basically just a lot of, not a lot of talk on how do you actually get through it, how do you actually deal with it. And so with all of this in mind, these were the different themes that came back as far as suggestions for what educators could do better to prepare journalism students for the field. And there were 4 that came back, but I'm going to really focus on that first one, which is mentioned the most often by the participants. Transparency is key. And so basically this theme is all about just educators being more transparent and upfront about the realities of the industry. And the main thing that they mentioned was making sure that you're transparent about the job's impact on stress, burnout, and mental health. They felt like this wasn't talked about enough, not normalized enough, and so there was a lot of stigma around these topics still. And they said it was important for journalism students know that it is okay not to be okay. They also said it was important for educators to talk about the availability of mental health resources when you work as a journalist and kind of guide them through where you can get these resources when you need it. Another thing they wanted educators to be transparent about was the low pay. A lot of them went into this job knowing that they weren't going to be paid a lot, but like as this one anchor said, he didn't realize how much of an impact that this would have, considering that this was his first time paying for a car, paying for an apartment. He didn't know the real life implications of that pay. So being more upfront about that with your students. Other thing to be transparent about is the daily expectations and work conditions. A lot of them felt like they felt additional stress at their job because they weren't prepared for what they were going to go through in their day-to-day lives. So talking through those daily stresses, what might schedules look like, what is the emotional and physical toll that could take on these journalists when they get into the field. The last thing one person mentioned that she wanted educators to be transparent about was changing careers as a journalist. She felt that even though it was a very normal thing for journalists to go through when they get to the field, it's not something that's always talked about in the classroom. As she says, she was sold this idea that it's a super noble career and everyone sticks with it for life. And if you don't, we don't talk about who leaves because they're just quitters. And so she says it's really important to normalize seeking out these options to curb shame and guilt amongst journalists. Okay, we're finally at the discussion chapter. I've broken it down by these questions to make it a little bit easier for everybody to understand. So we're going to start things off with the definitions. So as we talked about earlier on, we saw a lot of similarities with what we talked about in the lit review, right? Those main components of exhaustion, sinister abuse, efficacy did come back in the definitions mentioned by these participants. On the other hand, a lot of these participants also define burnout as the stressor itself, saying they were being overworked and overwhelmed, but also defined it as the impact of burnout, as this particular definition, struggle to continue in job, referred back to those turnover intentions. And so the variations in the definitions, do reaffirm the claim by these authors that how burnout is researched and how it is used in public discourse is not necessarily the same. Next, looking at the experience, the key point, again, younger journalists being the most likely to burn out. I think my research does affirm that, with 23 out of 25 saying that they did experience burnout. Looking at the impacts as well, what these journalists experience does match what past findings have found in terms of physical, psychological, and occupational outcomes. Again, a big trend was, burnout does trigger turnover intentions, and that was the same thing for my particular study. The one thing I want to point out that's, that makes my research stand out from others is that the stressors are extremely different for Generation Z. as we've seen them talk about it, things like the changes with the industry, like the MMJ model, added social media obligations, current anti-press attitudes. These are things that past journalists have not experienced and therefore has not really been covered in research as well. And so I think there's a lot of room for growth as far as research can expand here. Next, looking at the JDR model specifically, a lot of stuff that the journalists mentioned is the same as what we've heard from research before. For example, looking at the job demands, high workload, lack of job autonomy, and interpersonal conflicts came up with this particular sample, as well as with past research. Looking at job resources, feedback, and relationship with colleagues also came up in this particular sample as well. This study does confirm the dual process of the JDR model, which is demands equal exhaustion, resources equal engagement and motivation. And so that does confirm that. However, I did find a lot of trouble with drawing comparisons with my study to past studies because there was not a lot of studies that have used this model in the past. And so seeing the usefulness of this in my particular study, I think it calls for more journalism studies to utilize it as well. Other than that, personal resources came back as a significant factor for quelling those turnover intentions and stress and burnout for some of my participants. Yet the role of this has not really been explored in the journalism context. So a lot more research can be done in this area as well. Finally, looking at the suggestions to fight burnout, again, transparency was a really key term that came back with all of my conversations with these participants, right? They wanted both newsroom leadership and educators to be more upfront and talk about this, normalize the conversations around stress and burnout. Specifically looking at the newsroom, my participants struggle to identify an effective workplace resources and strategies to alleviate their burnout, which shows that there is a lack of support. Looking at the suggestions again, increasing resources, pay, benefit, staffing was a really important part for them, but managers can still take pretty inexpensive steps to reduce that stress and burnout. Checking in was a really important part, and just having that open door of communication with your journalists was a really important strategy that these journalists mentioned. Looking at educators, again, transparent being that really key theme. I want to bring up a study from Cook and Banks, who was the first study that really came up with that at-risk profile for journalists susceptible to burnout. And they shared that a journalist at risk for burnout found journalism to be much different from what was expected. So again, honing in that educators should be upfront about the realities of the industry with their journalism students before they commit to signing a contract. Limitations, there's been a couple in my study that I think could lead to future research. Because I focus on TV journalists who are working with a network affiliated station, I excluded journalists who work in cable news. I had to turn down a bunch of Spectrum News people. I had to turn down freelancers as well as journalists who are enrolled in the institution at the same time. And again, burnout doesn't discriminate, and so it would be important to include all these perspectives in future research as well. While generalizability was not a really important component of my particular study, snowball sampling does limit perspectives in my findings, and the way that I recruited does create some self-selection bias. In conclusion, my thesis, from what I know, is the first study to examine burnout amongst Gen Z journalists, and one of the more recent ones to update research about local television journalists. The biggest takeaway here, local Gen Z TV journalists are burnt out, and they are actively considering making a move to prioritize their mental health and well-being. But passion for the job, that fulfillment, and seeing their work make an impact on their communities was still a very big motivator that transcends their stressors. But that passion still wasn't always enough, because again, these journalists know that they're worth a lot more and they are not willing to suck it up and deal with it. My findings highlight a lack of workplace support and education that effectively deals with the stress and burnout, which again highlights the need for professional and educational intervention urgently. With that, I want to thank everybody for being part of my master's journey. When it closes off with a quote here from one of my participants. She says, "We're human enough to feel burnt out. We should be human enough to be there for each other when we feel burnt out, instead of just, this is just how it is, because that's not okay." So thank you so much for listening, and I'm open to any questions, comments, or concerns.
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I went to 30 minutes.
It didn't feel like it.
I mean, yes, I was about to say so much.
Which is a good thing.